Actually, believe it or not, I am too. I'm pretty. I have to just go like be by myself. It's like I can't do this anymore. After 16 hours of being with people, it's like
Yeah, yeah.
way too much.
You have to compare which line of work.
It's like,
Commercial
oh,
line director or professor, which is
right. Which is the more
takes more of a toll on the introvert.
right on the introvert. All of the above. You know, I've been doing this for over 20 years in some form or fashion.
Yeah,
So.
we'll swap for a week and both of us will be eager to get back to the West.
Right, exactly.
Because we're more comfortable introverted, even though doing that
Exactly.
has been doing it for a while.
Well, it's the reason I like to play board games too. You can, if you get a sufficiently complex one, you don't have to talk to people.
Yeah, except for playing the rules.
Perfectly timed. Perfectly timed. Thank you so much for playing for us this week. It's just beautiful. Appreciate it. Well, let's open with a word of prayer, and then James, we're looking forward to hearing Faith That Learns. Holy God, thank you for this opportunity to come together, to just fellowship, and to also hear from our brother, James, as he brings before us the topic of faith that learns. Give us open hearts and ears during this time. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.
Well, playing beforehand has two real advantages. One is, as an introvert, I can turn my back and not even notice how many people are showing up, which can be nerve-wracking, either because there are lots of people or because there aren't that many. Also helps create a nice mood, especially when you've got a challenging topic. And today we've got a challenging topic at hand for us. I've moved over here, and wouldn't you know it, people have moved up far enough that I'm like, oh, maybe that was a bad choice. But there are speakers here. You remember we were getting a bit of ring yesterday morning, and so this should work better in terms of volume and other things. And so this talk is going to get us wrestling with a challenging topic, and I'm going to bring together two texts that until a few years ago, it never occurred to me to connect, right? And I'm not going to start by trying to persuade you that you should connect them or that it makes sense to connect them. Instead, I'm going to start with one of them, arguably the more difficult of the two, and then we'll move to the other, and then we'll return to the relationship between them. And so the first one is this one from Mark chapter 7, verses 24 through 31. From there he set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." And when she went home, she found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon toward the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. As a way of working our way gently into this story, which I think is well known, how many of you have heard this story in some version before? If you know Matthew's version, she's referred to as a Canaanite. Essentially the same thing, right? The Syrophoenicians, right, the people in the region of Tyre and Sidon, those were those big, powerful city-states of Canaan that the Israelites never conquered. Before we dig into the story, by way of introduction to it and what I think is particularly difficult and challenging about it, I want to share a thought experiment. It's not one that I came up with. It's one that was posed to me by an atheist reading my blog. He asked me to imagine that I had a time machine, and so my brain went to this. As a Doctor Who fan, I immediately thought, oh, good, a TARDIS. And here was the thought experiment. He said, you can go anywhere you want in time or space. The question I want you to take with you is, what might you see there? What might you experience? What might be revealed as you explored history or went to the far reaches of the universe that might cause you to lose your faith? And the person who presented this to me was hoping that it would get me to show that my beliefs are unfalsifiable, that is, not open to being disproven. Right? When you have something that's unfalsifiable, it means you're not willing to accept any evidence that could disprove it. And if nothing can disprove it, then it's just something you choose to believe regardless of evidence, and it doesn't really have any value, persuasive or otherwise. Right? If I say to you that this podium or pulpit is made of cheese, and you're understandably skeptical, and you say, well, it doesn't sound like that. It's like, I've had some really hard cheese, right? And so then you're like, okay, well, take a bite, and maybe I'm willing to nibble on it. It's like, does that taste like cheese to you? It's like, well, I haven't had all those kinds of cheese. If I'm willing to, no evidence will disprove my assertion. It's of, what value is it, right? And so this person was hoping that I would realize that there are things in my faith that are unfalsifiable and thus, from his perspective, meaningless. I won't get into the full story of that now, but the reason I mention it is because of one of the directions it took me and what it revealed about what was important to my faith. I don't know where you would go, and maybe if you're interested in the question and answer time, we can get a survey. My first thought was go to around the year 30, go outside the city of Jerusalem, hang out outside a tomb on one particular Sunday morning, see if something interesting happens. And as I thought about it, I said, there were martyrs whose bodies were burned or who were thrown to scavengers. If it turned out that the disciples told a story not knowing what happened to Jesus' body and the Romans had mistreated it or something like that, would that disprove that God had vindicated Jesus beyond death? And I said, no. And so there's a sense in which that isn't a matter of history for me. But what really struck me about this thought experiment as I pursued it further was that if I went back to Galilee a few years earlier, followed Jesus around, and saw him, God forbid, kicking a puppy, or something terrible, right? Being not a nice person. It was like that would actually shake my belief system to the core at a much more fundamental level. Who Jesus was and what he was like was much more important to me, it turned out, than trying to prove even the greatest miracle that there might be. And you can perhaps see why that thought experiment was one that I thought was worth sharing here, because as it turns out, we don't need a time machine to be confronted with a story in which, at least it seems, that Jesus behaves in a way that's unkind, right? This story, as I really was confronted with it and paid attention to the details for the first time, realized offered me that challenge without the need for a time machine. And so the question we're going to wrestle with is whether this is a story about, as we might put it, Jesus behaving badly. There have been many attempts to avoid that conclusion, and I fully understand the desire. As I've already said, what kind of person Jesus was and is turned out to be more central to my worldview than any miracle or abstract theological doctrine. And so this story troubles me, right? Continues to do so. How have commentators tried to avoid the impression that Jesus treats this woman unkindly? Some have said that he was testing her. But if someone came to you pleading for you to heal and to help their sick daughter, and you decided to put them through some tests, would that be kind? Would that be gentle? Would that be compassionate? Others have pointed out that Jesus uses the diminutive form of the word for dogs, and so he must have meant cute puppies, right? Pets rather than stray mongrels. And while that might be right linguistically, I don't think it eliminates the problem, right? If someone were to come up to me, right, who belonged to a different national, religious, or other group from me, and asked for my assistance, and I said that helping them would be giving to the household pets what belongs to the children of the household, I hope we can agree that would be insulting, even if it's talking about pets. And however much you love the pets, right, it's literally dehumanizing. And so how can we make sense of Jesus speaking this way? I've shared, if you weren't aware of it already, why this story is troubling. Now you get to find out why I think this story is crucially important and why I chose to speak about it today, and genuinely believe that you'll be glad afterwards that I did. That's the part to be really skeptical about, right? But just hang in there with me. Despite what you'll hear in some churches and on some radio stations in the US, sin isn't just a matter of individual choices and actions performed in complete isolation from everyone else, who in their turn also choose to act in certain ways in isolation. Sin, evil, discrimination, bias, the whole range, the whole spectrum of things that we do as human beings is a tangled mess of interconnections and interdependencies. Anyone here watch The Good Place? Anyone know the TV show? Okay, we've got one. It's not a spoiler because you find this out early in the first episode. Everyone in that episode is dead. And it's set in the afterlife, and it does some interesting things exploring the afterlife, engaging with philosophy. And in one episode, and this is a bit of a spoiler, but the show's been around a while, and we're probably at that stage where anything I say about it can only make you think, oh, I probably should watch that. So they find out in this afterlife that the world is so complicated and entangled in all kinds of ways that no matter how hard you try to do a good deed, it's just so entangled with stuff that's not good that it makes a mess. So imagine you want to buy someone flowers, right, to make their day brighter. Genuinely selfless act. And then the point system in the afterlife is taken into account the underpaid driver who transported them, right, the pesticides that were used to make sure they look so nice and keep the bugs away, the pollution of from the truck that drove them here in the environment, countless others that were involved in getting them to the supermarket. And let's not even get started on the supermarket, right? You'd probably never even be able to disentangle that, right? I once had the idea of writing a book, like A Year of Living Justly, and thinking about all these ways that we're entangled with injustice and sin and things. And I realized there's no chance that I'll be able to figure out where every single item of food that I go to purchase locally comes from. And there's no way, I would need a lot of grant funding to work on this book project in order to spend the time growing all this stuff myself. Things are entangled. The show actually uses a tomato, right, for those of you who are looking at the details, right? And I hadn't noticed that Indiana gets a mention in there until I started preparing this talk and got this screenshot from the show, which was a nice surprise. That's where I'm from, for those who may be here for the first time. The reason I decided to use flowers was because, tomato, you might eat, I just want a tomato, right? It could be a completely selfish act, whereas buying flowers for someone seems like a better example of something we might do that might be selfless, although sometimes the reasons why we buy flowers can also be complicated. And so I want to acknowledge that, right? And so there are all kinds of things that we do, and we do them for a variety of reasons. For those of you who may be familiar with or part of the Catholic Church, it has a doctrine that tried to disentangle Jesus from the influence of sin, right? It's called the Immaculate Conception. My students regularly use that term as though it referred to the virginal conception of Jesus, but it's a different doctrine about Mary's conception, trying to shield Jesus from the heritage of human sin through his parentage. And personally, in my view, I think that even if one subscribes to that, it doesn't disconnect, it can't disconnect someone just by affecting their genetics, can't disconnect them from this tangled mess of social interactions, right? And that brings us to the crucial question. Could Jesus have grown up as a human being in human society without ever encountering negative views of other people groups? Even if no others were disparaged, the Canaanites are maligned in Scripture themselves. Jesus may have heard negative things about Canaanites not from other children playing in the street, but in synagogue, from Scripture. That in turn leads to another question. If it will be rare and perhaps impossible at least to guarantee that anyone will grow up never hearing about other nationalities in being spoken of in insulting ways at some point, then what's the best that we can hope for in the case of Jesus? What does maximal human righteousness look like in the midst of this tangled web of influences, including all the negative ones? The answer is in the title of today's talk, I think. It's openness to learning, to changing our minds. There is no way that Jesus or any of us could have been born into the midst of human society as fully human beings, and yet at the same time be completely isolated from all the biases that are found in every culture, in every group of classmates, in every nation, in every religion. The best that a human being can be is open to learning, to overcoming biases that are rooted in our genes, but also fostered in cultures and communities. In other words, and I may be biased here myself because I'm an educator, but humanity at its best is humanity open to learning, to growing, to changing our minds when necessary. I'll have more to say about maturity and faith in my next talk tomorrow. For today, I want to focus on faith and learning, and to continue approaching this topic through the lens of Jesus as learner. as we encounter it in the passages that I've chosen for us to explore, but also in the Gospels more generally. Right? And some of you may know the story of Jesus in the temple, 12 years old, another one where it's like, I'm pretty sure at least his parents would have said that that was Jesus behaving badly. I bet you they were more upset about him ditching them and them looking for him for 3 days than they were about anything he might have said about a Syrophoenician woman. Parents, you'll know what I'm talking about. We find it so difficult to embrace the fact that Jesus, unless we deny that he was a human being, would have learned that we sometimes rewrite what the Gospel of Luke explicitly says about this. It says that Jesus, when he was 12 years old and his family made a visit to Jerusalem, stayed behind in the temple to be found there later by his parents. And what was he doing? Right? The Chosen and other shows depict him as, it's like he was teaching them, right? But in actual fact, what the Gospel of Luke says is that he was learning. He was asking questions, and when the teachers asked him questions, he gave good answers to them, right? Those of us who are educators recognize that behavior as what we hope for from our best students. According to the Gospel of Luke, that's not a story about Jesus taking over the role of teacher, but being an exemplary learner. And that same gospel emphasizes the point that Jesus went home and was obedient to his parents after this incident, and he continued to grow not only in stature, but in wisdom. In other words, he continued to learn. As an educator who hopes that my students will learn, and that they will do so not merely in my classes, but will become lifelong learners, I'm delighted that this story about Jesus provides an example of this. The story of the Syrophoenician or Canaanite woman is a particularly vivid example. So in the Gospel of Mark, our earliest gospel, Jesus might well have gone off to the vicinity of Tyre and Sidon on his own. There's no mention of an audience of disciples as the events unfold, unlike what we get in Matthew. We're not told whose house he was in, but presumably it was someone he knew or had a connection with. The ancient Mediterranean world wasn't like today, where you can fairly easily go somewhere you've never been and check into a hotel. I often ask my students this: Paul is probably the person who travels the most out of all the characters in the New Testament. Goes all over the Greek and Roman world. How many stories are there in the book of Acts about him checking into a hotel? Not one, right? That wasn't the way they did things then. And so we should assume, unless we're told otherwise, that Jesus was relying on accommodation from someone he knew, whether that be a family connection or someone who had heard him speak and decided to support him in his movement. Why was Jesus there? We're not told explicitly in the Gospels, but I've often assumed that Jesus was looking for rest, right? We're told about crowds pressing on him just before this. And he went there and didn't want his presence to be known. Yet someone found out he was there, someone who had heard about his renown as a healer. That woman came to plead for mercy for her daughter. Instead of help, she got an insult. I'm sure she was furious. Wouldn't you have been? In her determination, and I think also her defiance, but also her wisdom and her motherly concern, she doesn't scream or merely leave disappointed. She sees a weak point in Jesus' argument about children and dogs and uses it to make her case. I think Jesus was impressed. He wasn't going to heal the woman's daughter, and because of her persuasive comeback, he changes his mind. And so remember that only person that we're told changed Jesus' mind in the Gospels was this woman, at least explicitly. I think there may be other stories, but we can come back to that if you're interested. And I think this was an important moment in Jesus' life. Although the Gospel of Matthew places this story after Jesus' encounter with the centurion, you presumably know, if you've read the Gospels and compared them to one another, that the Gospels don't consistently order things in the order that they happen, right? And they sometimes move things around for thematic or symbolic reasons. Logically, I think, Jesus' experience with the Syrophoenician or Canaanite woman would have had to come first. Finding himself impressed with that centurion, if you remember that story, he said that people like him would join the Israelite patriarchs, right, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, at the table, right, in the Messianic banquet. Getting crumbs was the first step. Giving them a place at the table, I think, was a step further. Why is this important? Why am I wrestling with this difficult text? Because those of us who are Christians regularly talk about Jesus as an example of humility. And yet so often we avoid the implications of stories where we see Jesus actually being humble, right? Because I think it's safe to say that there's no learning without humility. unless we're open to the possibility that there are things we may be wrong about, or things that we simply don't know yet, we won't learn. Is the reverse also true? Can we say that there's no humility without learning, without being confronted with things that force us to change our minds? Is there any way to foster humility other than by discovering our own limitations and being surprised by the breadth and extent of reality? So I said that the other text for today was going to be, and those of you who looked at the posters and things may have seen this, the story of the rich man and Lazarus. And before doing research for a book that included a chapter on the Syrophoenician woman and how it represented a pivotal moment in the life of Jesus, I hadn't noticed connections with this story. How many of you know the story of the rich man and Lazarus? Right? Let's listen to it. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was being tormented, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you're in agony. Besides all this, between you and us, a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us." He said, "Then I beg you, Father, send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, so that they will not also come into this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them." He said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent." He said to him, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." Did you notice the points of contact? Did they jump out at you now that I highlighted that I think there are connections between these stories? Right? We have the dogs. We have the person longing to partake of crumbs that fall from the table. We have a person who has something to share and doesn't do so. And the dogs show more mercy than a fellow human being does. I find it impossible to imagine that Jesus used this imagery without thinking of his experience with the Syrophoenician woman. In this story that Jesus told, we see Jesus exemplifying humility at its most impressive. He's taken what he learned to heart in a way that acknowledges change and growth. There's a strand of self-criticism in the story. Jesus had withheld or had intended to withhold what he had from someone in need. She had challenged him and he took it to heart. It became part of his life, his example, and his teaching. I find that makes the example and the teaching of Jesus more powerful, not less. We can come back to the topic of Christology, how we think of the person of Jesus in light of this towards the end of this talk, as well as in the Q&A if there's a desire. But for now, let's continue pursuing this thread. I don't just want to focus on the story's connection to Jesus' experience with the Syrophoenician woman. The story that emerged as a result of that encounter is wonderful and powerful just in its own right. And so I've got it up there. I'm not sure how helpful that is, having it up on the screen, but thought I should have it there. Right? So one of the book projects that I'm slowly working on is about humor in the teaching of Jesus. And I think there's more comedy, more irony, more hyperbole, more things like riddles in the teaching of Jesus than we tend to realize. And this story provides an example of that. We all know it by a name that reflects the first 2 lines of the story. It's the story of the rich man and Lazarus, right? And that's already striking. How many of you know at least one joke? Hopefully it's a funny one, yeah? Right? You can imagine a joke about, Bill Gates and the waiter, or Bill Gates and the beggar, or Elon Musk and the homeless man, or whatever. You can't imagine, or at least it's harder to imagine, you probably don't know a story that you instinctively tell about someone named Millionaire and Fred. And so by telling a story about the rich man and poor people, women in the stories, right? We never learn the name in the story of the Syrophoenician woman, right? People who are marginalized, who are not valued the way that elite men were, often go unnamed in these stories. And so by telling a story about a rich man, who, right? Sounds like an important guy. I should know this guy. Who is he, right? Unnamed. And Lazarus, who is named, right? Already is making the point even in those first lines. How many poor beggars do we know the names of is another question probably worth pondering. But the last will be first, Jesus tells us. The first will be last. The named will be anonymous, and the anonymous will be they'll have their names remembered. When these two individuals died, Lazarus is taken to the bosom of Abraham. What does that mean? Right? If you know the Gospel of John, which mentions the only son in the bosom of the Father, it means sitting at the right hand of, sitting in the place of honor next to. The rich man, on the other hand, is in agony, right? Notice that the rich man apparently knew Lazarus' name and recognized him, right? And so he wasn't passing by him and completely unaware. He had tuned him out, but at this point, when he's in need, he has all this information at his hand, right? He was not unaware of the man's plight while he was alive. He simply didn't care enough to do anything. Notice as well, right, even though he's had some prior contact with Lazarus, he's been in close proximity, never had the chance to meet Abraham before, and yet he addresses himself to Abraham and assumes that Lazarus must be like a servant who can be sent on an errand. And so he never addresses Lazarus. It's like, Father Abraham, send Lazarus, right? Lazarus in this place of honor sitting next to Abraham and doesn't even get addressed, right? And then I think in the great chasm we also have that separates rich man from Lazarus, right? Many people have looked at this story and said, okay, well, where's the great chasm and how do I make a doctrine of the afterlife that has all these details working out? And I like what Kenneth Bailey, that great New Testament scholar who did so much important work with the cultural background, said about this. He thinks that's the wrong approach, that this is basically what you might call a pearly gates story, right? And lots of people, right? I am a member of an American Baptist church. I'll tell a pearly gates story. I don't envisage St. Peter being there to welcome me with literal pearly gates and asking the kinds of questions that he does in the jokes. But I'd be perfectly okay telling one of these jokes if I thought it would illustrate a point. And so the point of the story is not to give us the groundwork, the details necessary to create a systematic theology of rewards and punishments, but to depict a landscape of the afterlife that conveys the message, right? And what Abraham says about the chasm, right, is, I think, striking. It's to prevent people from going either direction, including from his side towards them. And it doesn't say who put it in place, but we're to understand from that passive verb that it's God put it there, right? Why do you need a great chasm? I mean, on the one hand, it's to keep people from, who are in agony and, getting what they deserve from passing over. But it also says there to stop anyone from going from Abraham and Lazarus' side, right? And that's, I think, something important, right? You have people on that side celebrating whose instinct, even when they were mistreated in life, right? Lazarus probably would see this poor person there and be like, oh, come on, I've got to do something to help him. And has to be actively prevented. And I don't think the point of that being in the story is, God is going to actively prevent acts of mercy in the afterlife. And it's to make us laugh, but also feel convicted about this, right? That we can have no gulf between us and someone in need, and yet walk by them daily. And for those who treat others that way to get what they deserve in the afterlife, those who are merciful and who cultivate mercy will need to be actively prevented from showing it. Again, I don't think the point is fit that into your, add that to your systematic theology, but because it's comedic in a powerful and thought-provoking way. The rich man still doesn't get the most important points about what has befallen him and about who he's dealing with, right? Again, he still addresses Abraham, assuming that Lazarus is the servant and can run errands, and asks that he be sent to his brothers, right? Not send them and tell the world. It's like, tell my brothers, right? That's, we still see, it's like, okay, watch out for my family. They had presumably visited and feasted at this rich man's house, right? The story implies that they might recognize Lazarus as somebody who had returned from the dead. At the same time, it implies that they're in the same situation as their now deceased sibling. They're wealthy and not using it to meet the needs of others who lack basic necessities. One key point of the story is that those who have abundance judge the value of other human beings wrongly when we withhold what is in our stockpiles from those who urgently need it. If we're willing to pay attention to our fellow human beings and treat them with the respect they deserve, we'll avoid judgment. Lazarus' life was a miracle all along. If these siblings could not appreciate the message of his life before he died, they won't respect him enough to heed a warning from him if he returns from the dead. Those who have the scriptures have still further information, more than enough to alert us that God cares for the poor, the downtrodden. The central message of the prophets is that God cares passionately about injustice. Let's now return to the connections between this story and Jesus' encounter with the Syrophoenician or Canaanite woman. In the case of the scriptures, there was much that might seem to justify viewing and treating Canaanites with contempt. The overall gist of the scriptures was that the Canaanites were utterly excluded from and unworthy of the blessings that God had for his covenant people. Indeed, the land of the latter was taken from the former. What could be clearer? The rich man might have said the same about his wealth, right? Job was righteous. He was blessed with abundance. Even if this man was not as exemplary as Job, the man's wealth was surely indication of divine favor, merited by the man's righteousness, right? We hear what we want to, and conveniently fail to notice what we want to. In the background of the story of the Syrophoenician woman, we have Jesus' visit to her part of the world. What was he doing there? As I said, I tended to assume that this was an instance of Jesus needing rest and rejuvenation. The Gospel of Mark says that Jesus didn't want anyone to know he was there. Right? And I think I said that already. Why am I saying that again? Okay, here we are. We're told that great numbers of people had come and were crushing around him. It seems logical to surmise that Jesus went as far away as he did to escape crowds seeking respite, and yet had connections because people had come from far away in order to come to where he was. I hadn't actually lost my place. I just had this moment of deja vu. It happens when you make sure you mention things twice in order to not leave the audience behind entirely, and then you get confused. The fatigue of Jesus that we encounter in the Gospels is an important reminder of his humanity for those who might be inclined to forget it. The creeds tell us that Jesus was fully human as well as fully God. The Gospels make clear that Jesus was a human being. Yet time and again, and this is where we come back to that doctrinal point, because we don't know how and cannot hope to fathom how it would work for humanity and divinity to coincide in this human life, rather than live with the mystery, we deny aspects of Jesus' human existence in the interest of safeguarding his divinity. Yet there's no encounter with the divine in and through the life of Jesus except through his human life. And there certainly wasn't for those who followed him, who met him when he walked the earth. They did not have the option of starting with a doctrine about his divine nature and then trying to crowbar and trim his humanity to somehow make it fit. They encountered a human person. We need to allow the Gospels to give us that same kind of experience. If we fail to do so, we undermine one of the historic emphases of Christian discipleship, namely Jesus as example. How often do we excuse ourselves by saying, but he was God, but that was Jesus? The Gospels tell us that the incredible life that Jesus lived, he lived as a human being, relying on God's power. Taking the humanity of Jesus seriously, truly seriously, invites and inspires us to do the same. Tying the threads together as we draw to a close, Jesus, the lifelong learner, is another aspect of his humanity that we're liable to miss if we're trained to read in ways that avoid seeing it. Yet if we take it seriously, it becomes a source of inspiration rather than a doctrinal puzzle to be solved. Jesus had taken to heart the negative statements about Canaanites, the woes against Tyre and Sidon, but not the examples of faith and uprightness about them, about some Canaanites, right? The Gospel of Matthew lists Rahab, the Canaanite among Jesus' own ancestors, and also Tamar, who's often assumed to be Canaanite. By the time the Gospels were written, Jesus' followers were open to recognizing the Canaanites were part of Jesus' own story, as well as their own. According to the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 11, verse 21, Jesus made reference to Tyre and Sidon and warning his fellow Galileans, "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the deeds of power done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I tell you, on the day of judgment, it will be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon than for you." Notice what Jesus says, that if he were to perform miracles in Tyre and Sidon, powerful Canaanite cities, they would have repented. And so they will be judged less harshly than the Jewish towns of Galilee that saw his miracles. Yet having said that, when he goes to the vicinity of Tyre and Sidon, Jesus doesn't see it as an opportunity for this theoretical statement to become reality. He spoke insultingly about the native inhabitants of that region. One of them pushed back, and it made a lasting impression and impact on Jesus. It led him to grant a centurion a place at the table with Abraham. And it leads him to tell a story about the judgment of one who has good things to share and yet withholds even the crumbs from his table. Where once I found this troubling to my doctrine, now I hope and aspire that I might have the humility and the willingness to learn that I affirmed theoretically about Jesus, yet so often failed to acknowledge in practice. The story isn't quite done. How's this for a happy ending? In Acts chapter 21, as the author recounts Paul's travels, he writes, "We came in sight of Cyprus, and leaving it on our left, we sailed to Syria and landed at Tyre, because the ship was to unload its cargo there. We looked up the disciples and stayed there for 7 days. Through the Spirit, they told Paul not to go on to Jerusalem. When our days there were ended, we left and proceeded on our journey, and all of them, with wives and children, escorted us outside the city. There we knelt down on the beach and prayed and said farewell to one another. Then we went on board the ship and they returned home." What disciples in Tyre? Who preached there and when? Although we should not assume that other things did not happen, they're not narrated in Acts, the only instance we're explicitly told about in the New Testament when it comes to spreading the message of the kingdom of God in Tyre and its vicinity is the story about Jesus there, coupled with the statement that some from there had heard about him and went to see him as he taught and healed in other places. By Paul's time, there's a community of disciples. It explicitly mentions families. That's the fruit of the seeds that were planted by Jesus visiting there and learning from his encounter with a woman from the region. His interaction with her, his openness to changing his mind made an impression. May the same be true of us, and may we embody that same attitude as we seek to follow Jesus' teaching and his example in our own lives. So, to sum up, I don't think there's any way to avoid the conclusion that Jesus spoke in a disparaging manner about a people group other than his own. By taking Jesus' humanity seriously, including this story, we have maybe a doctrinal puzzle for some of us, but we have a powerful example for ourselves if we take it as such. The best that's possible for human beings is not static perfection from birth, but openness to learning. We see the impact of what Jesus learned from his encounter with the Syrophoenician woman in what he says about unto a centurion, his parable about the rich man and Lazarus, and in the existence of a vibrant community of followers of Jesus in Tyre a couple of decades later. Thank you.
Okay, questions, comments? Yes.
Interestingly enough, I have a number of thoughts, so I'll line them out and then we can get to the end. But in Judaism, in a yeshiva, what you hear is nothing but arguing. Not adversarial arguing, but they're arguing the Torah, the prophets, and what they're reading. But somehow the church has gotten to a point that if you question, then that's wrong, and everybody looks at you like, oh no, you believe what you've been taught. It's become a bad thing to question. But in this study we're doing right now, Michael Bird and Tom the New Testament and its world, one of the things that they say is, this is a craggy story. this doesn't line up perfectly. And so instead of trying to make it, which we seem to have done in the church and put things together, and like you pointed out so well here, let's not look at these things. Let's look at it this way and accept it this way. And I love what they say is, spend time thinking why God gave it to us this way, which you've done a really good job of pointing out. There are a lot of things we need to look at here, and it's okay to do that. In fact, we're encouraged to do that. So thank you so much. More of a comment than a question. Thank you.
I appreciate that. And it connects with the point I made last time that, or at least I think I made it last time, yesterday. Seems like a long time ago, doesn't it? It's been a busy, very rich and rewarding few days here. But about the fact that there was a time when I would have said, I believe the whole Bible, I take it all, it's all in there. And you can only say that when you haven't really familiarized yourself with all of the contents in a lot of detail. Otherwise, you might still hope it's true, but it's not. You realize that there's material within the Bible itself that challenges it. And I remember it took a long time till I realized, I'm defending my doctrine about the Bible from the Bible. I don't think that makes much sense. And I don't think that's something that's sustainable in the long term. Maybe I should actually, because if the Bible's supposed to be my ultimate authority, and that's the whole point of having a doctrine about the Bible, then maybe the Bible should be allowed to, determine my doctrine about the Bible rather than vice versa. And I was silencing so much of it. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and that as a part of the post-Enlightenment modernist agenda to make Christianity neat and tidy. And fit in all the categories. And as one of my homiletics professors at a Catholic seminary said, every fence we put around God, God is a wild and growing thing, and he will overrun every guardrail we put up. Yes.
Well, thank you for challenging us, and I certainly embrace your second point about openness to learning. Help me reflect on your first point, though. Would you say reflect a little bit more with us or with me? Yeah. What does your first point have to say about the idea that Jesus led a sinless life?
Yeah. So I was thinking about that and something that I was going to say, I said, okay, that might distract. I'll keep it for the Q&A because I'm pretty sure this will come up. But we had somebody who was, preaching with what's the expression? Preaching with a view, preaching, with a sort of basically auditioning for possibly becoming pastor of our church. And there were lots of reasons I had qualms about this individual, but one thing that they said that really I was like, that's just such an unhealthy way of thinking about human existence, mentioned in their message or in some talk that they gave to us, that when you hear a baby crying, right, it's just like, sort of selfishly demanding to be fed, that's an example of the sinful nature at work. And I was like, no, that's a baby who's hungry and who needs to be fed and has no other way of expressing it, right? And I think that if we think about the stories that Christians told, right, they wondered about his childhood, and yet the New Testament documents conveniently leave out most of the childhood. But if we look at some of the later Gospels, like there's one, the infancy Gospel of Thomas, where Jesus is a right old menace. If you do read it or have read it already, you'll probably be glad it's not part of the New Testament. But it is an interesting example of the church wrestling with what's somebody who's not fully mature like, but who has like divine power present in them, and what's clearly not an orthodox work, and so I'm not recommending it except as the kind of thing that is interesting to think alongside, as well as of historical interest. But what does it mean to be, perfect as, and sinless as a child? And how does that relate to being sinless as an adult, right? Because an adult who is constantly crying and demanding that they be fed is a problem, right? And I think a baby doing that is not. And so surely what that suggests is that the process of growing to maturity involves change. And part of what we learn to do as humans, if we make the progress we're supposed to towards maturity, is to learn to control some of our instincts, to recognize that it is appropriate to want food when I'm hungry and to seek food, but not to demand it and to expect others to be responsible for bringing it to me while I scream and shout at them. And yet that was perfectly appropriate, right? There's an age at which a child who is, sort of grabs and says mine, it's not selfish, it's a lack of understanding of boundaries and of other people's, possession and property and things. And yet for an adult, the same behavior is extremely problematic. And so I think that what I was saying today actually sort of transfers more generally to this, that to lead a perfect life, to lead a righteous life even, just thinking in those terms, is to learn to manage and control the things that are woven into our instincts. We have an instinct for survival. We have an instinct to feed ourselves, to procreate. And the rabbinic tradition was mentioned, and one strand of it, they talk about sort of the good impulse and the evil impulse, but certainly one strand of it would talk about it, sort of say the evil impulse is not inherently evil. It's the stuff that leads us, that ensures our survival as individuals and as a species, but which we need to learn to control, because left, if we follow it without self-control, it gets us into trouble and harms others as well. And so I think the process of leading, whether we're talking about a sinless life or simply a righteous life, is learning to do that and apply that through the process of change that every human being undergoes. And I think that if we don't say that about the case of Jesus, then in fact we're denying his humanity in the process. That said, I will fully acknowledge that the creed said, fully human, fully divine, without mixture, without, uses these withouts. And there are scholars who've worked on Christian doctrine who've said, those guardrails that are put in, you can only treat them as sort of safeguarding a mystery. Nobody who's tried in practice to get those things to all fit together neatly has come up with something that's entirely satisfactory. So, right? Yeah.
Of humanity and divinity.
Yeah.
Where do you think they meet?
Yeah. I think, what I've become more comfortable, I remember reading, I've actually looked for it and can't find it. It wasn't in the book that I thought it was in. You read these things over the years. But I remember somebody talking about the language that the church developed, right? About the humanity of Jesus being sort of anhypostatic until it was combined with the divinity and using all this technical Greek language. And the theologian who was writing about this history of Christian doctrine was like, that's beautiful and very impressive language. How could anyone claim to know that? Right? And so I've become much more content to say the earliest Christians were working with the fact that they knew this human being and had an encounter with God in and through the life of this person. And what we get is an attempt to express that in ways that safeguard, don't diminish the reality of the encounter with the divine or the human. And at that point, my ability to feel like I can tie up all the loose ends runs out, and I think it's safer to acknowledge that than to try further.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. A place
Thank
of
you. Thank you.
around the mystery, right? Yeah. And also, I think too, just to sort of add to the discussion a little bit, that how we define sin is also at stake here. Yeah, and how those categories have evolved over time. Yep. Others. Dan, I know you have a question.
Dan had questions before I started.
I thank you very much. What I just heard you say, that fully human, fully divine, but we put an asterisk on the human part of that, and maybe we ought to remove that asterisk when it comes to this idea of learning and evolving. But there's another thought that I have about how to interpret some of these different things. And the question would be, is it possible that Jesus is not only telling parables, but enacting parables for the purpose of teaching us, and that some of these difficult passages, which we go, whoa, he's tipping over tables in the temple, and maybe they are enacted for the purpose of the divine theater that will be retained throughout our faith history.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I do think that Jesus engaged in what we might call acted parables, symbolic actions. If you read through the prophets of ancient Israel, they did those kinds of things, right? Jeremiah, it's like, everyone's to submit to the yoke of Babylon. What am I going to do? Okay, let's go in with a yoke, right, and have that thing. Ezekiel is the one who does the weirdest things. I can't believe that somebody thought it was a good idea to market Ezekiel bread, right? Because you keep reading the passage, and it's like, it's not just the recipe for what goes into the bread, but what is baked over is, but you can go to your local health store and get that. But doing the little, enacting the siege and building the ramparts and things, and if he'd had Playmobil or Legos or little military plastic figures, would have probably used them. And it's interesting, right? The story about Jesus in the temple. On the one hand, those of you who've come yesterday and today and talked to me a bit probably gathered that I like puns. I think Jesus made some puns as well. And so my favorite way that I've heard that story referred to is as the temple tantrum. But I think the Gospels actually make clear that it's not Jesus going into the temple and it's like, oh, I'm really angry, I'm going to start throwing stuff, right? The Gospel of Mark says he went into the temple, looked around, it was really late, went away, came back the next day, and then did this thing. The Gospel of John tells us he made a whip out of cords. I am not a whip maker, and so do not know much about this, but it sounds like a process that takes a little bit of time, right? And it actually uses the term for a Roman whip. And so I wonder if this isn't an action that's symbolic, not just of, driving out, commerce and things like that, but Jesus spoke about the destruction of the temple, right? And possibly indicating, the Roman involvement in that by making a particular type of whip, right? If the Gospel of John's terminology is for that specific reason. But at the very least, he goes in and sits down and is doing the thing, it sounds like, because the whole action is prophetic theater, I guess we could call it. It's
performance art.
Right? It's performance. It's conveying through action, through symbolic action, as effectively as Jesus also, many times uses words. So thank you for that. I definitely think Jesus did that sort of thing, and that's a very good example of it.
Dave?
As usual, I'm very perplexed about many, many, many things. But
me too, if that makes you feel better.
I want to start with the thought that, is there any importance to believe that Jesus was sinless? Well, yeah. But, certainly Jesus made mistakes.
Right. Yeah.
Hopefully he learned from his mistakes. And as an example to us, we should learn from our mistakes. We should attempt to be sinless, but that doesn't mean we're going to be sinless.
Yeah.
What?
Sure.
And then I'm going to get back to, why does this make any difference whether he is sinless?
Yeah.
If you believe that your objectives in life are to love God and love your fellow man, who cares whether Jesus was sinless?
Yeah. No. There's a question there, and it's a wonderful one. And I certainly, on the one hand, wanted to present this as something that I think is fully compatible with historic Christian orthodoxy. On the other hand, some of us present, I'm a member in an American Baptist church, and we tend to go along with historic Christian creeds whenever possible, but we are decidedly non-creedal, right, as a denomination and as a tradition. And so, if the historical evidence suggests something, I don't have any, I will follow the historical evidence where it goes. And the truth is that when it comes to an assertion of Jesus' sinlessness, There is no possible way that a historian could ever prove that, right? I mean, even with a time machine, you would need 24-hour surveillance, right? And if it's possible to commit sins of the mind, then you would need mind-reading equipment as well, right? There's no way to, but I think even asking the question about that traditional doctrine gets at some important points, because for a lot of people, it's like, well, Jesus can't have been mistaken. It's like, so are you saying that just to be wrong about something is a sin? Why? You know, where does that come from? It certainly doesn't come from the Bible, right? We sometimes end up with such a negative view of our own human existence as such, right? And yet, you know, we assume that these things that are, you know, less than perfect are not reflections of, you know, how we were created in the image and likeness of God. But there's no sense in the scriptural account of creation, right, that humanity is created not merely innocent, but perfect, right? The depiction of Adam and Eve in the garden is very much as, you know, childlike, right? I ask my students, right, you know, because it says they walked around, they were naked and not ashamed. I say, who walks around naked and not ashamed? I'm always worried that one student's going to put their hand up and say, my roommate. And I'm like, no, that's not the answer I was looking for, right? They're childlike. And the main character, right, it's not, his name is Adam, right, which is also a good English name. It's Adam, which is the word for human, right? And I suspect that if the character's name was given as human with a capital H, we might realize this is a story about what it's like to be human, right? And we go from innocence and not having to worry about good and evil to having to discern between good and evil and sometimes not doing a very good job of it. And men are plowing the fields and women are giving birth and experiencing pain. And it's about going from, you know, childhood to adulthood, and it's about what this aspect of human existence. And by talking about Jesus as the last Adam, I think what Paul's saying is not, oh, you know, historical figure here causes all the mess, but Jesus gives us a different way than we're accustomed to and that has been predominant of being human, right? Not something that is, you know, requires a complete sort of reset and, you know, gene therapy or something like that, as we might imagine, but that within the framework of how we were created as bodily beings, as genetic beings, living a righteous life. Right? So to answer the one question that was definitely a question, do I think you should feel under any obligation to subscribe to the sinlessness of Jesus? No, although I should probably ask about your denomination, whether it's going to get you into trouble before I answer in any kind of detail.
No, Wesley would say that mistakes, he had a whole doctrine of what is sin and not sin, right? So John Wesley he said that if it was a mistake, not sin. If you did something inadvertent, not a sin. And that being perfected in love was not about moving towards some sort of, you know, blank slate of sinless perfection, but more of growing in our love for God and others, period.
So interestingly enough, sorry, I'm always talking. Interestingly enough, if we take what Dan said about Jesus' performative nature in teaching, and we take what, you're Dan too. Dave, well, I was close, that's pretty good for me. Dave, and the question of sinlessness, you can kind of put that together in a sense that Jesus was fully human, meaning he was not perfect in the sense of perfection, but fully God. So was that a demonstrative of what we can be as humans, as he was human, but fully engaged with God? We still can get not angry, as Jesus did. We could get frustrated, as Jesus did. We'd want to go away and get away from things, as Jesus did. Speak to a woman, you know, because he's not in the best of moods, and say this, he did. Yet be who he was. Just a thought. Just a thought of the demonstrative, and maybe the whole thing is to show who we can be, and not trying to achieve perfection. Just a thought.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly has a deep, profound impact on our spiritual lives when we think that, you know, and this is woven into the history of the church and some of the major moments in it, that sort of God is just sitting around waiting for us to mess up somehow, right? And that's all it's about. As though, I mean, coming back to the rabbinic tradition again, right? There was some point where there's a story, I'm trying to remember the details of it, where they were debating some point of interpretation of Scripture, and they couldn't settle the matter. And eventually a voice from heaven comes, and that should have settled it, supposedly, right? But the rabbi had a verse to quote that said, the answer is not in heaven or something like that, and was able to say that. And it depicts God as laughing and saying, my children have defeated me. It's like, and actually, sometimes when our children kind of run circles around us or get up to mischief, I'm going to resist the temptation to tell any stories about my son, because I hope we're going to keep coming back to Lakeside and don't want people to be like, oh, you're the one with that story about, So, but there are moments when they're not doing what's right, and yet we think they're adorable, because of, they are just being human. And I think if we can make room for that, not in a way that's like, it doesn't matter what we do, but in the sense that there's this process of discovery, and we're not getting it all right. And sometimes we act with the absolute best intentions, and we still cause harm, right? And sometimes we act with the worst intentions, and we just get really lucky. And it's all complicated and entangled, and God understands that, and that the world, even as depicted in creation, right, once it became populated with a diverse abundance of people, would everyone always have been happy with what other people were doing? And thinking about that tangledness as possibly something that's supposed to be there in creation, that would always have made us uncomfortable, that we would always have learned from and benefited from if we were willing to experience it that way. I think that's a helpful direction. And I haven't explored that as much as I now will, thanks to you asking the question, so thank you.
Well, thank you so much, James, for this ability to have dialogue and discussion together. We have one more day with James tomorrow at 9 a.m. I do hope that you will come and hear Dr. Athnos today, 11:30, up at the train station, his final lecture on reading the New Testament through resurrection eyes. And we look forward to finishing out our time with James tomorrow. God bless. Have a great day.